Welcome to On It, a podcast for people who crave inspiration to address what feels off in their sexual lives. I'm Lorina Manzanita, a somatic intimacy coach and trauma resolution practitioner. Join me and my brilliant colleagues as we explore ways for you to experience more pleasure and juicy intimacy that resonates with your soul. Welcome, On It listeners. I'm Lorina, somatic sex and relationship coach, and I'm here with Bridget Ryan. She helps queer humans integrate tools for radical self-acceptance so that you can create a world where you feel seen and secure, enough to flow into others around you. She is an intimacy coach and community organizer, and today we're talking about liberating eros and deconditioning your desires, which is a bit revolutionary in my brain. I mean, liberating eros, I'm all for that. But deconditioning your desires, this is a new concept for me, and I would love for you to unpack a bit. What does that mean, Bridget?
Yeah, what are we even talking about, right? So at the core of it, there is an aspect of the things that we desire that is pre-programmed. And what I mean by that is we're taught certain things. And we'll get into sort of how and where and what's in this conversation here, but just like propaganda, right? We can look at the way that marketing is used to sell an idea to us, right? Sell a product to us. Similarly, these same tactics like representation and the way certain things are presented and the way certain other things are othered are done somewhat strategically. And it isn't necessarily done with malice, but it is kind of a byproduct of sort of both a capitalist society that a lot of us live in and also norms, right? Normative structures that have transcended generations and religious structures and all sorts of things to ultimately boil down into what we understand as what is normal or what is right to seek. And then anything outside of that, right? A desire outside of that is therefore by that definition, abnormal, right? So we're less
marginalized.
We're less inclined to even allow ourselves to think about it. And so this same approach or the same thought process, I believe, and other experts believe, can be applied to our sexuality and our desires.
So are you saying that our general culture, consciously and unconsciously to a certain degree, shares these images, promotes these ideas that shape our desires, and it has, because it's kind of capitalistically driven, or it's got these other historical influences, it kind of narrows the bandwidth of our desires, or at least our understanding of what's acceptable desires.
I believe so, right? And I think it's causing a particular amount of tension in society recently, because a lot of these norms kind of contrast what a lot of us, certainly in my generation, were brought up understanding, right? The socialization of being independent or being, doesn't necessarily align with some of the outdated norms that are still being applied to relationships and sexuality. And I think it's in part why there's so much tension in so many different aspects of different forms of identity. But certainly when we're talking about sexuality and gender identities and all the different factors that kind of really play into what we're ultimately talking about when we're talking about human to human desires.
Right. And then so this podcast is about sexual integrity. And so I'm hearing that part of the challenge of being integrous with yourself is that there's these cultural expectations and conditioning. So maybe we have an innate desire, and then it hits these layers of expectation that are born outside of ourselves. And then so there's this conflict that happens in that space. And then distortions that happen on the interpersonal and relational level.
Totally. And I would even go even further than that to say that even the things that aren't necessarily causing tension or friction, the things that we believe to be like let's just take like relationships as a whole, right? It's really, really common for us to hear like, I have a type, right? Who's your type, right? That type can change, right? That type, what goes into, right? The factors that weed down into who my type is, even those things can be challenged, even because sometimes it isn't a point of friction that it's brought to the surface. More often, many of us just exist completely blind to it. And we aren't even aware of whether or not our full spectrum of desire is being actualized. And when you use the word integrity specifically, what makes integrity so interesting is there's like kind of like dual fold, right? Integrity at the core is what it is defined by me for me, defined by you for you, right? And that's what makes it so interesting. It's like, are we actually being integrous if we don't know those parts of ourselves, if we haven't met those parts of ourselves? So it's both a internal and, I mean, probably most likely a projection, right? It's both limiting ourselves and also shows up in the ways that we connect with and express sexually with others. And that's where things can get really sticky, you know, when we're talking about integrity, right?
Right. Yeah. Could you give me an example in your personal life? Feel free to push back on me if it's like a little too intimate and personal for like public display, but I kind of want to make this a little bit more real. It doesn't have to be necessarily connected to integrity, but this piece around deconditioning, like, and types, like, I'm really kind of curious. Do you have examples from your own life that you can share? Like illuminates what we're talking about here.
So I definitely, I think my trajectory in terms of like my sexual expression, who I date and how I relate to people is 100% a living example of what I'm talking about. Because I grew up in a pretty suburban, very white, like pretty closed off community. I grew up in an Irish Catholic family. So even though we weren't religious, right? We went to church, but there was still enough influence from all of those different layers that 100% ultimately developed into this type, which was a blonde, blue-eyed white boy, you know, and that is who I dated, and that was my type, right? And once I actually, literally just leaving that town and living in another place where there was more cultural diversity, that alone, literally just the exposure to other people of different backgrounds opened up my, I feel attraction to these people because I'm sharing space with them and I'm building a relationship with them. And so starting out from a like very pretty cis hetero, person to where I am at now, which is pansexual. I place really no limitations as much as I can. And I try and challenge any limitations that I do place on myself because I started to take a look at certain things that I learned, like 1, the gender binary, 2, the heteronormativity, 3, mononormativity. Right. So for a very long time, I didn't even know to question that there was a possibility that there was any other form of relationship structure that might work, let alone whether it would work for me. There was no other thing but either being single or being in a monogamous relationship. Right? Like, I think that's a really good example right now is that's becoming more and more popular, right? Like more people are talking about non-monogamy. And so now all of a sudden more people are non-monogamous. More people are talking about trans communities. So now all of a sudden more people are trans. No, it's just that there's representation. So more people know there's an option to be, or they maybe feel like maybe it's safer to be because they see others doing it. Right.
Yeah. I'm having a moment of just appreciation for one of my clients that like grew up in pretty intense religious context and inherently identifies as gay and not in the normal gender spectrum. normal binary spectrum, right? And just the grief and hurt around not being welcomed in their family system. And I'm just feeling like gratitude for the plethora of menu options that you and I get to be blessed with in this era where more and more people are wanting to liberate their eros, and explore different ways of being, of relating, of expressing, of being intimate, of exploring desire that's just has a lot more richness and texture and flavors to it. And so we're talking about integrity. It's kind of like integrity means to me means a certain amount of coherence between what's happening in here and what's happening out there. There's a bunch of other layers that's possible, but when what's possible out there seems so damn limited, there's ways we might feel inspired to contort ourselves and disconnect from ourselves and repress other parts of ourselves, all in the pursuit of belonging, which is an inherent human need. So I love that we're in this process culturally of deconditioning our desires by thinking more and more outside of the box.
And just feeling safe to question it, because like you said, we are in many ways very blessed to be in a time where there is more representation, at least in modern times, than we've ever had before. And because of that, I was able to question, because I was able to literally see a couple who did things differently, I was able to then question how and where that might apply for me in my life. And if anybody is listening and thinking I just don't see how this could apply to me, I used to walk around and say that I don't do relationships because I'm not good at them. I'm a relationship coach now. You know what I mean? It's not that I wasn't good at them. It's just that I was trying to contort myself into something that was not meant for me. And the truly insidious and heartbreaking part of this, and why I do what I do, is because it's the opposite. That depth, that social divergence is your superpower, right? It's we get to cast even wider. We get to, love even wider, and we're less restricted, and we have more opportunities for pleasure and for growth and for learning. And if you break it down like that, which is just kind of facts, right? Without the shame rhetoric on top of it, it's easy to go, wait, that actually sounds like an advantage, not a disadvantage. That sounds like a benefit to be able to have a even wider range of connection with humans. As you said, being a basic core human need to belong and connect. And yet social structures and what we're talking about, right? Why deconditioning and deconstructing is so important is because even if we can look at those two things next to one another, we both we both know that society doesn't reflect that. It's definitely not easier in society to be queer or easier in society to be trans right now, right? So what is that disconnect? And how do we get to a place where society and the norms of society, if we need to have them at all, actually reflect society? Why is there such a gap there?
Great question. Why is there such a gap there? And so I'm a little curious, what's your take on helping to transform society? And I want to say kind of from the inside out. Yeah.
So I'm a firm believer in this process for radical self-acceptance. And it's interesting because I get some flack sometimes from people who just see that from the outside and they're like, oh yeah, what we need is more ego, right? More people who are just out for themselves. And it's interesting because the process of radical self-acceptance, at least in the process and the formula that I use, is starts with looking at where we sit at this point between privilege and disadvantage, right? It starts so as to be able to come into a space of awareness around where we need to be more compassionate, where we need to be like shining our privilege and light onto others, where we need to be taking a huge step back and letting other people have the platform, like where we need to be challenging the things that we've been taught. And so one of the first things that I think is really important in these conversations is to actually talk about and look at the factors that play into our attraction. Because right now it's presented as if we're just kind of born this way and then we're just attracted to people that look like us, right? Like that's a lot of the narrative.
Or not look like us. I mean, I tended to date like white, tall, lean dudes, which is nothing like this.
Yeah.
Filipino American were strong ethos of assimilation and like Filipino colonialism. And then so I've generally like been attracted to historically, like oppressors, colonial images. Not as much in the past few years, but like, I mean, not just
ask you is like, now with that awareness and with the work that you do now, like, has that shifted at all? Like, has the attraction is shifted, not necessarily away from completely, but has it, what's different now?
I would say that there's been an expansion for sure in kind of like the palette. There's still like areas that feel like maybe more hesitancy, or there isn't an automatic like drawing movement towards. But I would say like, height variation has happened, body type variation has happened, like more color, different diversity, I find is happening as well. I don't know if I've consciously been deconditioning myself. So Go ahead. Actually, I think a bit of the shift happened like early pandemic, when the whole Black Lives Matter tsunami emerged. And there was at some point of me just kind of asking myself the question of like, okay, I'm just going to assume I've got some racist programming in me. And I'm going to like look at all the various races and then kind of see what do I have like the most reaction to. And I was kind of surprised to find out that it was other Filipinos that I had the most reactivity around. And then so I started looking at, started reading some books and started getting more into the whole decolonization world. Yeah. And I think that timing of it all, like certainly in my communities and in like my predominantly white communities, the conversation has started to happen similarly around that time. And I think conversations about race and just in general in the white communities took a notch up because people were actively starting, and this is not to say that this is like the problem has been solved, but certainly just from the communities that I shared, these conversations were happening more than they have ever happened before. And for sure,
the process of actively going and looking at, hey, what am I literally reacting to is a practice in deconstructing your your desires. That right there, one of the first things that I kind of offer to people is to look at, one, what is your relationship to power? Like power dynamics, truly, like, and really look at it, right? Because there's like, we internalize these things, right? These are not just messages that are presented to white people, right? These are messages that are presented to everybody. And the internalization of that, we all do in different levels based on our lived experience, but, that message is really strong and really loud, right? Thin, white, tall, white, right? As the ideal. So to assume that it's only white people that are internalizing it, like is crazy, right? Like to your point, it affected who you were also attracted to, right? And I have these conversations with a bunch of different people I know for myself. And even to this day, as a newly openly queer person, if I'm in a crowd of people, I can still feel that there's a faster draw of attraction sexually to a male-bodied person, and it takes me a longer time to warm up to a femme or a female-bodied person, simply because of my conditioning. Right. Simply because somewhere still deep inside of me, there is that, you know, I only have 3 years of like reconditioning to be like, no, all bodies are beautiful. All bodies are attractive. That's what that's my core belief. I have 30 years, right, of this other programming. And this is where removing shame from the conversation is so important to me. Like, there is no right way or no perfect way or no ultimate goal. Every single one of these conversations, every single time we take a look at and go, wait, what do I literally, like, going through your dating app profile? That's a really good one. Like, who are you just automatically swiping left on? Like, who do you not even read the profile on? Like, that's an exercise that I actually did that was recommended from a friend of mine. Like, just really looking at what your body does. And so for me, and I'll just speak again as a white person who was socialized as a white woman, I actively started through a course that I was in where they were having us look at that visceral reaction. And I noticed that there was a visceral reaction for me that was like a point of activation around Black men. That is 100% my conditioning, right? And so I spent the next couple of years actively working against that. One, digging into and educating myself more on how these things actually come to be. Like, really doing like actual anti-racist work as a white person, I think is truly necessary if we're talking about integrity in any fashion. And then actively having the dialogue, like sitting down and allowing people who I am lucky enough were willing to do the emotional labor to share what that is like, and then to actually put myself in situations where I was dating other people and other cultures outside of the white community, and turns out it's a really beautiful experience. And there's a lot, you know, like talk about expansion, like how limiting is it to only date and have sex with people that look and talk and sound like you know? And at the same time, I do think that it's important to note that there is a certain ability to truly see one another that until we've done the work, like, is harder for certain people who sit in positions of privilege to do that with integrity. What I mean by this is not tokenizing someone, right? Not like, oh, well, I would love to date you because you're Filipino and I've never dated a Filipino woman, Lorina. Like,
that's super attractive.
Ew. Like, gross, you know, like, oh, how stressful do I feel, you know, but, and this is the thing, right? And the reason I bring this up is because I don't want to say, I in the learning process, and I'll just, again, speak for white people, in that learning process, there's mistakes, and there's still that old, like, colonial conditioning that exists. And so how and where that's applied in a sexual setting is really, really precarious. And we have to be really, really careful. And I think ultimately it starts with the awareness of what is actually motivating my attraction. And if I don't know, like, if I can't trace that back to either a familial system or a movie that I watched as a kid, or, you know, something that I can then kind of peel apart and go, well, where does this actually align with what I truly deeply believe in myself? Like, if we don't slow down to do that, I think we just run the risk of like perpetuating violence, you know, unintentionally. But certainly, even if it's not perpetuating violence, it's certainly not fully in integrity. You know what I mean?
It's certainly not inclusive. Yeah, and it deprives us of connecting with another human who might happen to be in a particular skin suit that you've been like distanced from all that conditioning.
Yeah, for sure. And there's so many, like, there's so many different points that these things play out for us, right? And I guess I will say it's important to note that what we're talking about here is, like, there are certain aspects of sexuality, and I would say a lot of what people root in is that this is a biological thing, right? That our sexual desires are driven by biology. Some aspects of our sexual desires are driven by biology. Like, and it's not often the ones that people people think or talk about, right? Like, so for example, we're talking about like strictly desires, like what we're attracted to, testosterone levels, right? There's experts that study testosterone levels, and that, you know, it often equates to being attracted to certain features. So like, but notice how that has nothing to do with gender. Notice how I didn't at all talk about anatomical parts in that sense. I talked about testosterone levels because I, as a vagina having, womb having, you know, human, can have higher testosterone levels than a penis having individual, right? So it's like having these conversations in ways that, just in that example, we can look at what we're talking about, how gender norms and sexuality norms infiltrate the actual conversation of desire, and then we just sort of run with those as if they're facts, as if it is biology, when in fact the gender binary is a huge aspect of biology, of what we talk about as biology right now, right? And so separating those things and looking at those things and really being real with ourselves about where things like race and ethnicity, things like sexual orientation, things like gender identity are actively playing a role in what we decide is attractive to us. When we decide to, you know, and what we choose to be attracted to, because it is a choice.
You were going to get into 5 factors that shape desire. Is that correct?
We can talk about that. Yeah. So I kind of touched on the biological factors. Psychological factors are a really important one as well. And this, again, everything I ties back to all these different sort of intersections. But like psychology, the literal time and place in which the mental state in this moment where I am acting on or not acting on a felt sense of desire matters. And I'll use a personal example of this. So as somebody for a very long time, and still could to this day, I'm just more aware of it, I used sex as a way to bypass emotions, right? It was a outlet, and it became so deeply ingrained in me that I would feel horny. To this day, if I'm really, really anxious, I feel horny, right? Whatever story I tell myself, because it's just a visceral reaction, right? I'm just having a reaction in my body, but the story is that that I'm feeling horny, right? And so I had almost like developed this like mental state response that would trigger, right, my sexuality. That's just kind of one example of sort of where it's more of like a trauma response that can lead to or play out in our sexuality. But there's like all sorts of different psychological factors. And I think trauma is a really important one to note here, right? Like how and where trauma shows up in our sexual expression, and being aware of how that may or may not show up in others, and how we may be also like influencing or perpetuating an environment where they feel disempowered maybe to say no, or right, like just being aware of potential mindset factors that ultimately do lead to our sexual expression, I think is really important. So I note those 2 first, because there's only so much we can do about biological factors, right? And there's a lot we can do with psychological factors, but for the purpose of this conversation, let's just call that almost like something that's happening in our bodies, right? The others are environmental, personal preferences, and social and cultural context. I would argue 4 of those 5 things are things that we can influence, right? We aren't just born attracted to a certain thing. There are these factors that over the years influence what we develop eventually as just a personal preference. But we can recode those, right? We can actively seek out being attracted to things by changing our environmental factors, by sharing proximity with other communities, by questioning our personal preferences and asking how many of those were actually ours and how many of those were just given to us by our parents or social media, right? And then the social and cultural contexts. Like, I think you gave a really beautiful example of a social and cultural context of just being a Filipino person in a white or in America, right? Where it's like, even that influenced your attraction as a Filipino person, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of what we're talking about here. It's, I think far too often look at sexuality and sexual integrity as not or I guess I'll say this differently. We should be separating those things out and looking at them as individual pieces and not just something that is, right?
So deconstructing and like being able to differentiate the different threads, because normally there isn't that level of inquiry or curiosity. And then so things that just seem kind of like fused together and therefore like come in as a single package.
Hardwired.
That's hardwired.
Right?
You're saying is not necessarily true, that there is a space between those various layers: biology, gender expression, desire, social context. Like those could be parsed out, and in that space we have more creativity, we have more choice, we have options. Is that what I'm hearing?
Also, I think like I have this belief that like our core need as human beings is to truly be seen, right? To truly be seen, like in our wholeness. And that is also love. Right? It's like Trish, I think you actually know Trish from Love Skills, but Trish Wright is a coach, and she talks about love is the radical acceptance of what is, right? But if we can't see what is, if we've closed off ourselves to somebody's wholeness, to somebody's fullness, to somebody's full expression as a being, which requires us to look at all of those different points of what made them who they are, right? Then we can't truly see them. I would argue we can't truly love them.
Right.
And I would,
so if we have all these biases and conditioning and maybe distortions from trauma, like creating this filter between us and the other person, and therefore like making it very difficult to see them, then we can't truly love them. And then so we need, what I'm hearing is this like invitation to go through this deconstruction, deconditioning process where you're getting curious about what's on the lens. And maybe you can't totally take away the lens, but at least you can go, oh, here's the lens. And I could do some like recalibrations in my brain or in my system to be able to like look beyond this lens.
And I think it ultimately comes down to consent, right? Like at the core of really what we're talking about is consent. And what I mean by this is like, if I am aware of a particular dynamic, and again, I'll use myself as an example just because I feel like it will help kind of make sense of what I'm saying. So one of the main dynamics that I took from a like cis hetero mononormative understanding of what love was this sort of possessive nature of a man. Like if he wasn't jealous, if he wasn't like, then he didn't really love me. And so that was deeply programmed. And as I'm sure you can imagine, caused a lot of problems in my relationship as a pretty strong, independent woman who was not actually socialized to fit that box at all. So I wanted this thing that I could not be, and actually nowhere inside of me wanted to be. I was like so much friction and so much pain, so much harm for so many years. But still, that was something that was true for me for many, many years. Now, in my sexual expression, it still exists. I still kind of get that like fluttery feeling when I feel like I'm like, because I'm in the kink and BDSM world, I do it consensually. I literally will act out this whole dynamic with another partner and consenting parties where I'm going to go and I'm going to like flirt with somebody and I want to like see you get all like, like riled up, and like, I want the whole feeling of it because it's still programmed for me to be like, I still get off on it. It still is in my body somewhere. And so this is a good example of how sometimes we can recognize that there's problematic like conditioning that we've taken into our relationships. And it doesn't even necessarily mean that we have to get rid of it. I think a lot of the time we're in this mindset, like, I need to change, I need to be better, I need to not necessarily. Sometimes it's sometimes we reach the point we uncover something and we're like, okay, I don't necessarily need or want to change this thing, but now I'm doing it from a state of awareness. I definitely don't want it to be non-consensually happening in any of my relationships. I definitely don't want my male partners to be jealous and possessive and like in my actual dynamics. But in this little context where I can, play with that part of my brain consensually, like that's one example of what we can do, but nothing can be done until it lives in a state of awareness. Like that's my goal, is to get it to a place where we are looking at the things that may potentially be impacting our ability to truly connect with one another. From that place, you get to decide whether or not you want to continue. And if you don't, then it takes some work to decondition it, right? And to kind of input other bits of data and slowly kind of flush out the system. And there's processes and steps to doing that as well. There's coaches and therapists and resources to help it. But until it lives in a state of awareness and you decide that it's actually something that you would like to shift and change, there's not a whole lot that can happen aside from it continuing to play out. And I'm sure you see this in your coaching as well, as it often continues to play out as problematic patterns, relationship patterns. Until
and limitations aren't serving people, right? Like thinking of some clients where maybe they've got like a big boob sort of fetish desire, and then but meet a gorgeous human being that's got all sorts of beautiful qualities, but doesn't necessarily sport this thing that's kind of like programmed into them as like a desirable trait. Like it limits them. They don't get to enjoy the pleasures of that being if they allow themselves to be just kind of limited by this conditioning.
I think that's a really great example, because that is, and you see it all the time. And I've experienced it, right? In the dating world, I've experienced it where there's it's almost as if like the depth or the vastness of what this person does offer in all of these other areas literally can't. And what's so interesting is the person who's experiencing it in my experience, person who is like wanting to be or can see all of the beautiful, valuable things that this other person is offering and they can't get there. That is, like, the pain occurs for both people in that scenario. The pain occurs for the person who's like, I know that, like, how can you not see that this connection exists between us all because I don't have big tits? Like, that's so, such a, oh God, like, and at the same time, on the other end, this person, like, I'm like that feeling of like, oh my God, like, I have to limit myself from this incredible connection. Because the reality is, again, this is only in my experience working with those. I can think of a few coaching clients and actually an ex-partner of mine who it was really kind of traumatic for him to realize that his own limitations that he has placed on himself actually inhibited his ability to be with me. Right? Like that was really heartbreaking for him. Because he couldn't change it. Not like immediately, right? It's going to take years for him to decondition that belief system that led us to where we were, right? But me being a open, queer, non-monogamous person, caused a lot of tension for us because he was, traditionally brought up in a kind of cis hetero male environment where your girl doing those things is challenging,
threatening,
right? And so it causes a lot of pain. Like this our own limitations cause a lot of pain for us and for the other people that we're trying to engage with. And if we're not doing this work and we are just simply going out and blindly engaging with people, particularly those that sit at any sort of like potentially marginalized community, you run the risk of causing harm. You really, if you want to love people, certainly those that exist, that have at any point been marginalized by positions of power, then you really you owe it to yourself and to those people to educate yourself a little bit on their experience so you can love them better.
I'm just going to take a deep breath with that. Beautiful piece. Yeah. Really, deconditioning desires as a pathway towards deep loving is what I'm hearing.
Of self and other.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing, is this work is about accepting all parts of ourself, right? Even the parts of ourself that we have denied because of white supremacy, or denied because of capitalism, or denied, right? Like, it's bringing all of those parts back to self. So it's actually like a deep practice of unapologetically loving all part of ourself. Because again, I'm going to get a little woo-woo here, but I think something tells me your audience.
Please.
Because there is no separation. There is no separation. We are one at the core of being, of energy being. So denying any aspect of self, even if it lives in another, is not truly loving all parts of ourselves, right? And so those biases and those judgments that we place on ourselves and also project outwards are just another version of us not fully loving and accepting ourselves. So if you're somebody out there who's like, whatever, like, if you're not motivated by the want to connect more deeply with more people, if you're like, I got my people, I don't care. If you can hear that there's probably likely huge chunks of yourself that are waiting to be loved as well, hopefully that, that motivates, because that's what it's all about.
Yeah. And this feels like a beautiful tie-in to your offering that's coming up, which is about self-acceptance, self-love, and creating more safety. Can you speak to that? What you're up to there?
I'll do a quick boil down, but essentially this is the workshop is a 2-hour workshop. It's on March 12th from 12 to 2 PST, and it's on it's called Safe, Secure, and Liberated, 3 Leaps Towards Radical Self-Acceptance. And essentially what I've done is I've broken down what I refer to as kind of the 3 main layers that stand between like core self and like the outer meat suit of self, right? And each layer, and I really like to do my workshops in such a way that like people walk away with it, like with tangible, actionable things. And so in the workshop, we're going to introduce some relatively complex topics, but in simple ways. And then provide resources and actionable like things you can do to start to shift each of those core areas. And the goal of which is to really start to, like you said, kind of move in that alignment, because that's what integrity is, right? Is like moving in a place of like that core sense of truth, and also reflecting that in the way that we move in the world. And so this is sort of like the precursor, right? These are like the first 3 main steps that I have found through my 15 years in the field, that I think really boiled down what is otherwise really complex and sometimes overwhelming. And so we're going to do that for 2 hours, and you'll walk away with a little workbook, and you can always refer back to that as a resource as you're kind of going through this process for yourself. So I'm really excited about it. I think it's going to be really, really impactful, and I think people are going to get a lot out of it.
I believe that. I hope they arrive. They come and find you. And for those listeners that might listen post March 12th, is there anything you want to offer them that it lives in that kind of tangible, something that they can do and to continue the work?
Yeah. So I am going to be putting this online, and like the digital recording of that workshop online anyway for people, just because I think this is the type of work that I want people to have. Access is more important than anything else, I think, for that. So that will live on my Professor.Playtime Facebook page.
Okay.
And April 1st, I'm going to be launching a full 7-month program where we're going to be deep diving into all of this. So the radical self-acceptance is sort of, like I said, that precursor. This is sort of like a high level, these are some actionable steps that also really set the tone for what we're going to be going way deper into over the 7 months.
Nice.
And that will start April 1st. You can find all that information on our... Do you want me to drop the website? Is that helpful?
feel free to. And also in the notes of the episode, wherever I put it out, I'll also put it in like links or wherever those little bits of text get attached to.
I would say just as a little plug for any of our events, because there's also the For Love, like virtual play parties that we're always running. And we try to do free workshops often just in support of the community. So the best place is to go to forlove.love. And then there you can see all of our events, all of our coaching work, all of our workshops and things like that.
Great. Yeah. Any other pieces you want to share before we transition?
I don't think so. I think the only thing that I would leave people with is that if you're, this work is not easy. This work is not easy. Like actually questioning your sense of reality is arguably one of the most difficult things that a human being can do. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. And so I want to like really drive home that like not to minimize the magnitude of what it is that we're actually calling people forth to do. And you don't have to do it alone. Like there are communities, there are resources, there are free resources, there are paid resources, there are people that can do this alongside you. And so if you're in this position where you're really feeling like, you know what, I want to go deeper in my self-understanding and you aren't sure where to go, reach out because while I am only one person who's only lived one white queer experience, there's a whole community of people with vast diversity that are ready to talk to you and to help you and to welcome you into the experience through their lens.
Yeah. Seeking support, acknowledging that it's not an easy path, but like the beauty of liberating eros and really being able to love ourselves and each other. Like, I think that's desirable for all beings. And so like having compassion for yourself through in this journey, and also not feeling like you need to do it alone. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Bridget.
Thank you.
This is so rich. And thank you, listeners. You can find more information about Bridget in the show notes. And I hope you've received all sorts of juicy gems from our talk today. Till next time.